going on, everybody? Welcome back. Another episode of Trey.codes. As always, my name is Trey. I'm here in one of the private rooms within the co-working space, common desk co-working space within the Ion in Houston. I thought it'd be a good idea to check out a new location as far as where I normally shoot at. I used to go to a library or somewhere else, so I think it's got a nice little aesthetic here. But that's besides the point. Today's video is actually going to be focused on how you can filter queries within GraphQL and MongoDB. If you're familiar, I did a project recently where I created a simple backend application using Heroku, MongoDB, GraphQL, and Apollo Server. And that was simply just to demonstrate how you can create a backend on the fly pretty quickly. And today, I want to dig deeper into that video a little bit. We're actually going to build on top of it, I guess you can say. And I'm going to demonstrate how you can be more specific with the data that you're trying to retrieve by adding filters to those queries that you send to GraphQL. So, as always, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. Alright, so before I start the video, I don't really have any specific shout outs to give as far as videos that I've watched to get better understanding, because I'm not really doing that much of a difference as far as any new technologies I'm implementing or anything like that. So it's not really a channel I follow, but I will say that one of the gentlemen that watched my last video, I'm going to mispronounce his name, so I'm not even going to say it, but I'll just drop an image to his comment that he left on the last video. He pretty much was asking me, can I show how to filter using date range, picker, ID within Flutter and passing them in as variables. So I got the idea from him, and I thought it'd be a good way to demonstrate that. So that is exactly, well, he's kind of the inspiration for this video, so shout out to him. But then also I thought it'd be good to actually show what he explained. So we're going to make a Flutter, not make a Flutter app, but we're going to be sending data from a Flutter app to our backend using that filter and getting the data back specifically how we want it. So shout out to him. So there's three main parts of what I'm going to be discussing in today's video, and the three parts are related to how we filter the data. So the first way that we're going to be filtering the data is by IDs. And as you can see here, I have the app, it's called Simple Library. I made some modifications to the UI, but I have a list of books currently in the database, and I'm going to have three ways that they can filter. And the first one, like I said, is by ID. So in theory, we're going to enter the IDs of the books that we want to bring back to retrieve those. Second part is we're going to filter by the author of the books. So if I type in Dr. Seuss, I should only get Dr. Seuss, I should only get back one book. And then finally, we're going to filter by a date picker range. So any books that fall within the selected dates that I have set for start date and end date, they'll be brought back as well. So those are the three components for how we will be filtering our data today. So I'm in the Simple Library project, and I'm in the API directory. This is where I'm holding all of the GraphQL, MongoDB, API stuff back here. So first thing that we need to do is we need to create a new declaration for our type defs that's going to represent the book filter. And the book filter is going to be an input type, and it's going to specify all the ways that we can filter our data. So we'll come within type defs within the index.ts file in our API project, say input book filter, IDs, which is going to be an array of ID types. And like I said, this is going to be how we are going to specify how we want to filter our data. So later we're going to be adding author param here and then some dates as well. But for right now, the first thing we're doing is filtering by ID. So we have the IDs property right here. Then I need to create a new input called book filters input, which will hold a filter param, which is going to be that book filter that we specified, as well as a limit param, which is going to be of type int. So basically, when we send data to our backend, we're going to be sending it as an object of book filters input. So it's going to be a map that contains either a limit or a filter object. Then we need to come down here and add a new query type. We'll just call this books. The input is going to be that book filters input, and the return type is going to be a book or list of books guaranteed. Even if we get nothing back, we still get an empty array, which is something. So similar to get books, books is operating the same way right now. Then we need to come down to our queries, and we need to create a new query called books. And we'll specify args. And first thing we need to do is we need to extract both the filter and the limit params from that arguments. Remember, the arguments are going to be book filters input, essentially. Okay, so I'm going to come over here, and first we'll say const filter equals args.input and const limit equals args. Now, the reason that we have to do args.input for the filter is because our filter object is of type book filter, which is of an input type, so it's wrapped in an additional map. But limit is directly of type int, so it's not wrapped in anything extra, so we can just call it directly off of the args. Then we need to check and see if we should be applying this filter in the first place, and the way we're doing that is if there is no filter, then we don't apply the filter. All right, so const should apply filter equals filter does not equal null. Okay, if it's null, then that means we shouldn't be applying filter. So if we should not be applying that filter, then all we want to do is, I'm just going to copy this from get books. We're just going to return all the books based off the limit, because we're going to assume that if we don't have a filter, then we have a limit, and if we have a limit, we don't have a filter. All right, that might be kind of backwards thinking about it right now, but just for demonstration purposes, just know that we're going to have one or the other. So if we continue on, if we do have a filter, then we want to specify, all right, what type of filter are we doing? So first, we're going to check and see if we should be filtering by IDs. So we're going to have another conditional that says const should apply IDs filter, and that's going to be true if filter.IDs does not equal null. So if we have IDs on our filter map, then we're going to filter by IDs. So with that being said, if should apply IDs filter, whoops, then we're going to first extract those IDs from the filter IDs property. So we're going to say let IDs, which is of type array string, equals filter.IDs. Then we need to make sure that all the IDs that we brought back are actually formatted in the correct way for us to query them in MongoDB, because if they're not, the app can have an error and we would get some unpleasant results. So we're going to say IDs equals IDs.filter ID. We're going to call our types object ID is valid and pass in that ID. Okay, so this is basically saying bring back all the IDs in that list that are valid object IDs. Okay, and then once we do that, we're going to perform our normal query, book.find, and we're going to be looking for IDs, because that's what we're querying for, the ID objects. And we're going to use some more MongoDB syntax, $in, and then passing the IDs. And the $in says, bring me back all the documents that fall within these acceptable IDs that we specify. Okay, so I think that's all that we need right now. If we run npm run build, make sure that that builds properly, and then we're going to start our server. Npm run start, open up localhost. All right, let me get rid of this because this is some old data. So we got our books query, so we're going to specify a query, specify the books. We want all the fields brought back, and then we have our input, which is book filters input, and then we have our two options that we can put on that book filters input object. So let's start with limit first, just to make sure that that's working. So if I specify a limit of 5 and then hit query, I only have 4 books in the database right now, so 4 clearly falls within that. But we have our books right here. Let's see, okay, that's why it was over there. Outliers, Cat in the Hat, Total Money Makeover, the Unplugged Alpha, all brought back with the limit filter. Now, if I instead want to use the filter or the IDs filter, I'll specify an array of IDs, and I'm going to copy an ID for outliers, and we're going to paste that in here. And then if we send that query, that didn't work. Okay, something is wrong with our query here then if that didn't work. IDs. Okay, I see what I did wrong. I added an extra S in here, so it's not going to work for the query. So let me try this again. npm run build, and then start our server again. All right, now if I refresh this, and we're going to start from the top, take all this out, specify query, books, all the fields bought back, input, filter, IDs. Actually, I should have, I can do it this way as well. I want to go to MongoDB real quick and just copy one of those IDs that are in the database, and I'm going to pass that into the array of IDs, and now I get that one book back for the ID that I specified. So our IDs filter is currently working for our backend. All right, so now it's time to test this out on the Flutter side. So we're going to be doing a similar thing. We're going to be creating an additional service within the GraphQL service I have in Flutter that's going to call the GraphQL endpoint in order to get our data. I'm going to copy this get books query because this looks like the most similar method that I have so far that we can model after. Mind you, we have this query that we're going to copy over in a second, but we're going to name this books instead, and instead of a required limit, we're going to make it optional this time because we can either have a limit or a filter. And then we're also going to have an optional list of string called IDs for the filter. All right, now we need to do a few things similar to what we did on the back end. We need to first see if we need to apply the limit or apply the filter. But first, we're going to create a map called input, because we're going to pretty much be nesting our input and our limits and our filter all together on these maps. So I have a map called input and a map called filter that are both empty maps right now. So the first thing needed to be done is create a boolean called should apply limit, and that's going to be true if limit does not equal null. If we should apply that limit, then all we're doing is adding a map name, a map with a limit key and the limit value to that map. Then what we're going to do is, all right, if we have a limit, then we'll go with that. Otherwise, we should go with the filter. We're going to create another boolean called bool should apply filter, kind of similar to what we were doing earlier. And this is going to be true. Should apply filter is going to be based on if we have one of the following: the ID, the author, or start and end date. Since we're only doing the IDs right now, this condition is going to be pretty empty, but it's basically going to say if IDs equals null, we're doing the opposite of that. We're negating that. So the condition is going to build up to eventually say if IDs equals null and author equals null and start and end date equal null, then we're doing the opposite of that, meaning that we should not apply a filter. Okay, and that'll make more sense in the future, but just follow along with me. So if should apply filter, then we're going to nest in and see, all right, which filter should we be applying? So create another boolean in here called should apply IDs filter, and that's going to be true if IDs does not equal null. If we should apply the IDs filter, then what we're going to do is we're going to add to our filter map those IDs that we specified, okay? And then at the very end, we'll add the filters to our input. And we'll do that by creating a filter key with the filter. All right. So I think that's all we need right there. So now it's time to come over to our GraphQL. And the good thing about messing with GraphQL, well, through Apollo server, you can just copy the queries directly in here. So I'm going to just copy and paste this, clean it up a little bit, escape these two params, and then instead of limit, we're going to be passing in the input as our variable. Okay, so that was good. The result is going to be books because that is the name of our query, and that looks good. Now let's go to our home screen. I already have this method being called, so I'm just going to uncomment it for now, and we're going to take out the start and end date because we don't have those yet. We just have the limit and the IDs, and we're going to pass in books to our books param. So we're going to be calling that books API. We have the IDs specified, which is going to start out as an empty array. So on page load, there will be no books because we're technically filtering on an empty array of IDs, but then I'll specify a specific ID, and I'll do that right now. I'm going to copy this ID for outliers, and we're going to come into the app right now, go over to our filter, and I will submit this ID, allow paste, hit enter. All right, so now our list of IDs has been populated with that ID. If I hit submit, we get that one book back for outliers. So the endpoint filtering for IDs is working both on the back end as well as on the Flutter side now. All right, we got the IDs working. Now we're going to update our back end to take in another filter type. So we're going to head back over to the API. I'm going to be going back and forth with me, so just bear with me. Also, something to keep in mind is that I'm running the back end locally through Apollo server, so it's on the local host, but I also have it pushed to Heroku. So all the changes that I'm making on the local side is already in the cloud, so to speak. So that's why it's working on the front end in Flutter. If you were wondering, how is he getting the results if he's running it locally and his API is pointing to the back end? So that's why. But anyways, back into index.ts. We're going to update our books query. Close this out. We're going to add another query. So similar to the IDs, we're going to have one for filtering by the author of the book. So we'll create a condition called should apply author filter, and that's going to be true if filter.author does not equal null. Okay, starting to see a pattern here. It makes it very easy to kind of handle all your filtering this way instead of trying to do it some other way that I'm not privy to. So should apply author filter. If that is true, then we're just going to return a simple query that will be looking for the author. So we'll take this map out and instead pass in filter.author. Okay. And we also need to add author to our book filter input. And that's going to be of type string. So that's all we need to do there. If I run this, when we first build this, and then we're going to run our local host again to check this out, npm run start. All right, if I refresh this, I'm going to take all this out, select the query, books, all the fields, input, we want the filter, and we want the author. So if I have an author that's empty, no books are brought back because clearly we need an author. But if I type in Dr. Seuss, we get the one book back, which is Cat in the Hat. Okay, so our backend is working for filtering for the author. So now I'm going to hop back over on the Flutter side again. So what we need to do is come back into our GraphQL service for that book endpoint, and we're going to update our query to handle filtering for author. So create a new condition, should apply author filter, and let me pass in an optional string for author. So if author does not equal null, that means we know we need a filter on the author. So if should apply author filter, let me sure I'm in the right spot. Am I doing this right? Oh, I need to be nesting this within the should apply filter. So we're checking up top for the IDs. Okay, author does not equal null. Yep. Filter.add all author key, author value. Okay, and now we need to update this should apply filter condition to now check and see if author equals null. So as you can see, we're pretty much saying if IDs and author are null, we don't want to apply a filter, but we negate that, meaning we should apply the filter, and that's how we fall into this if statement. So now we have our query for the author. I think that's all we need there. Back on the home side screen, we're going to update that query call wherever it's at. Okay, so we'll say author, and we have author text controller. So if the text is empty, we're going to count that as null. So we'll just pass in null. Otherwise, we're going to pass in that text on the author controller. All right, refresh this. All right, now if I come over to filter, let's type in Malcolm Gladwell. Hit submit. All right, we get Malcolm Gladwell back. Let me try Richard Cooper. My God. All right, we got his book, the Unplugged Alpha, brought back. Okay, so working on the back end, working on the front end for the author filter. All right, last but not least, we're going to be querying by a date range. So we're going to specify the minimum date and the maximum date, and we're finding documents that are within that date range. So similar to what we've been doing, first let's update our book filter to take in the start date, and we're going to specify these as strings, end date as well, because when it's coming from the Flutter side, it's being submitted as a string, ISO string more specifically, but we're going to be operating with it as a date object. Okay, so just know that for the type def, it has to be specified as a string. So now we can come back into our query, and we're going to create another condition, should apply date filter. We'll say date range filter just to be more specific. And that's going to be true if filter.startDate does not equal null and filter.endDate does not equal null. Okay? Both of those statements have to be true because we can't have one without the other. We can't have a start date with no end date, otherwise the range isn't going to work, and vice versa. So if should apply date range filter, we're going to extract those dates into their own variables. So let's start date, which is of type date, equal filter.start date, and let end date of type date equal filter.end date. All right. Once we have both of those, we're going to be doing a normal query. So I'm going to copy and paste that. But we're going to be querying on the year param, and we're going to be using some more MongoDB lingo, $GTE, and that's going to be the start date. And so GTE just basically means we're looking for a value greater than or equal. So GTE greater than or equal. So the documents we want have to be greater than the start date, and then they also have to be less than or equal to the end date. So this query right here finds all the documents who have a year between the two ranges that we specified. Let's build this, npm run build, and then run our server as always. All right, let me refresh this, take all this out. Don't want to mess with old data. All right, got a query, books query. We want all the fields back, input, specifying a filter, and we have our start and end date. So for the end date, I'm going to say 2030 0101. Let me put double quotes on that. And then the start date will say 2020 0101. Now if we run this, all right, so don't think you probably don't know the dates on all these books, but these books are within the range that I specified. And just to prove it, I'll make the range a little bit tighter. So if I put 2024, 2023, still greater than, let me see. Okay, so I think I have most of those books. I'm not sure what I have on them. And I know in MongoDB, I can't see. Oh, I actually do the time. Okay. 2015, 2023. These aren't all the books. Let me see. 2023, 2023. So we have one book in 2015. So if I specify a range that excludes 2015, like, well, the one I just did, this range right here excludes 2015. So we only get those 3 books back because they were in 2023. If I lower this to 2014 for the start date, I'll get all the books back. All right, so the date range is working on the back end. All right, jumping back to the Flutter side, let's wrap this up with querying for the start and end date. But one thing I want to point out is instead of checking to see if the IDs are null, we should instead be checking to see if they're empty, because technically the IDs can never be null because we have this ID that's already been identified as an empty list. So it'll never be null. So instead of checking for null on the back end, we can handle this a multitude of ways, but I think the easiest way would be kind of how we're handling with the author is if IDs is empty, then we'll just pass in null explicitly. Otherwise, we'll pass in those IDs. Okay. Now back to what we were working on. We need to pass in an optional date time start date and then an optional date time end date to our books query. And then we need to also update our should apply filter to also check for start date being null and end date being null. So that's there. Then we need should apply date range filter, which will be true if start date does not equal null and the end date does not equal null. We need both of those to be true because we can't properly pick a date range without both of them. Okay, so if should apply date range filter, we're just going to add a filter, add all with a map that has a start date key and then the start date value, but we have to convert it to a string because remember on the back end we're expecting it to come in as a string, so we'll convert it to ISO 8601 string, and the end date, same thing, just going to convert that to a string, to ISO string. All right, so that is all we need to do here. Then back on the home screen, we're going to pass in those params. I already have the start date and end date as datetime objects. They're already hooked up to the text controllers. So we have start date, we're going to pass that in, and then end date, we'll pass that in as well. Oops, end date. All right, now if we refresh the app, now if we come back over and hit filter, and keep in mind, since we're now checking to see if IDs are empty or not, since IDs are empty, we're passing in null, meaning we're not going to be filtering by IDs, and thus we get all those books back, and that's why we see all four of them right here. But besides the point, we're going to pick a date to filter. Let's pick 2020, September 10th, and then 2024, September 10th. We hit submit. All right, so we get 3 books that are within this range because they were all within 2023. If I make sure that I try to include that September, or no, the 2015 book, and I'll do it at the top of the year just to be safe. We hit submit now. All right, we get the outliers, which was released in 2015. I'm not saying that these were really released in these days, but just for the example, that's the day we have. But it's working on the front end and the back end for our date range picker. All right, so that concludes today's video. As I said, it was all about filtering our data. As you can see, we were able to filter by a list of strings, which were the IDs. We were able to filter by text directly, which was the author. And we were also able to filter based on a range specific to 2 dates that we send from the Flutter side or the backend, however you want to look at it. But those are 3 primary ways that you can filter your data. And of course, there are a myriad of different other ways you can filter. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but it's a good starting point for when trying to just break down your data in a little bit more compromising way and kind of figuring out, all right, what data do I want? Do I want all of it? Do I want some of it? How do I want it? Blase, blase, but you get the drift. So hopefully this video was helpful. If it was, please leave me a comment. Let me know what you think. Let me know your thoughts on GraphQL, MongoDB, the whole shebang. And leave me any comments related to any videos that you want to see me cover in the future. I'd love to discuss them. And I think I'm starting to find enjoyment in actually kind of like solving problems that someone suggests for me. So with that being said, this is Trey.codes, as always, signing off. I'll see you next time.